Hello everyone, and welcome to Lumen of Ages. I am the man they called divine, yet my hands bled, cramped, and cracked, just like those of any ordinary mortal. My name is Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni, though history remembers me simply as Michelangelo. I was born in the year 1475 under a rugged Tuscan sky, destined to spend a lifetime locked in a relentless, exhausting battle with solid stone. They look at the towering purity of David, or the agonizing, graceful beauty of the Pietà, and they see only triumph. They gaze upward at the vast ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, marveling at the creation of Adam, entirely forgetting the blinding colored dust, the crippling physical pain, and the endless years of solitary confinement upon that wooden scaffold. I did not paint or sculpt for earthly glory. I did it because the figures were already trapped deep within the marble blocks, screaming for me to release them from their cold prisons. The stone spoke to my soul long before my iron chisel ever struck its surface. Florence raised me, Rome thoroughly tested me, and powerful popes commanded me. I walked among wealthy patrons and arrogant princes, yet I felt most alive alone in the deep silence of my workshop, breathing in the fine white dust of Carrara. Men called me a genius, a towering titan of the high Renaissance, but I was merely a fragile vessel for a creative power far greater than myself. I was a willing prisoner of my own relentless, haunting visions. Through decades of war, sudden plagues, and dangerous papal intrigue across the 1500s, I kept carving, kept painting, kept desperately seeking the absolute divine perfection that always seemed just out of my human reach. My 88 years of life were a furious, unbroken tempest of profound creation and profound despair. Today, across the vast ocean of time, I step out from the long shadows of my unfinished monuments to tell you the hidden truth of my existence. I will not give you the neat, polished myth carved by later historians, but the raw, unpolished reality of a man who traded his mortal happiness for eternal beauty. Listen closely to the echoes of my hammer, for the marble is about to speak. I was not born into a family of artisans or laborers. My father, Lodovico, considered the physical work of the hands to be entirely beneath our noble, though severely impoverished, lineage. I drew my first breath in the small town of Caprese in the year 1475. But my soul, my true artistic spirit, was forged in the rocky hills of Settignano. My mother, Francesca, was far too frail and sickly to nurse me, so I was immediately handed over to a local wet nurse. She was the sturdy wife of a local stonecutter. Instead of sweet milk, I swear to you that I suckled the very dust of the quarries. I vividly remember the sharp, acrid smell of chipped stone that perpetually clung to her heavy woolen dresses, a scent of the earth laid bare. I remember the rhythmic, metallic clinking of iron hammers echoing continuously through the valley, a relentless lullaby of iron striking unyielding rock. It was there, amidst the blinding white dust that coated the silver leaves of the olive trees, that the incurable sickness of the stone infected my blood. When I was just a young boy, my father would beat me savagely for drawing. I can still feel the sharp, burning sting of his heavy rings striking against my cheek and jaw. He would shout, his voice echoing in our cold, drafty house, that I was bringing unbearable shame to the ancient Buonarroti name. But the brutal beatings only fueled the burning fire deep within my belly. Every purple bruise was a physical testament to my unyielding devotion to art. I would carefully steal small, blackened pieces of charcoal from the dying hearth and hide away in the dark, damp cellar, frantically covering the rough, weeping walls with the muscular shapes of men and the wild forms of beasts. At 13 years of age, I finally broke my father's stubborn resistance and was reluctantly apprenticed to the great popular painter, Domenico Ghirlandaio. His bustling workshop in the heart of Florence smelled overwhelmingly of pungent linseed oil, crushed lapis lazuli, and the sour sweat of a dozen eager apprentices. It was a highly efficient factory of beauty, but I found his celebrated frescoes to be flat, entirely devoid of the terrible, crushing weight of real flesh and heavy bone. I yearned desperately for 3 dimensions. I yearned for the heavy iron chisel. Fortune finally smiled upon my restless spirit when Lorenzo de' Medici, universally known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, opened his private sculpture garden at the convent of San Marco. There, under the watchful, critical eye of the old master Bertoldo di Giovanni, I truly began to live and breathe. Lorenzo was a powerful man who smelled of expensive rose water, fine leather, and old parchment. He possessed a gaze that could pierce a man's soul, and he immediately saw the dangerous fire burning in my dark eyes. I clearly remember the sunlit day he paused silently behind me as I was deeply absorbed in carving the wrinkled head of an old faun out of a small piece of discarded marble. He chuckled softly, his voice raspy and deep, and gently pointed out that very old men rarely have a complete, perfect set of teeth. I did not utter a single word in defense. I immediately took my sharpest chisel and violently knocked out a tooth from the marble mouth, drilling deeply and realistically into the pale stone gum. Lorenzo was so immensely amused and profoundly impressed by my fierce, uncompromising obedience that he formally invited me to live within the opulent walls of his own palace. Those were the golden, fleeting years of my youth. I dined at long wooden tables with the greatest philosophers of our age, men like Marsilio Ficino and Angelo Poliziano. We passionately discussed the high ideals of Plato and the divine, eternal spark trapped within the mortal human soul. But my rigorous education was not solely rooted in high philosophy and polite debate. At night, under the cover of absolute darkness, I would quietly sneak into the freezing morgue of the hospital of Santo Spirito. The sympathetic prior allowed me secret access in exchange for a beautifully detailed wooden crucifix I had carved specifically for him. The thick, suffocating stench of rotting, putrid flesh was entirely unbearable. It violently assaulted my nose, clinging stubbornly to my dark hair and my rough clothes for days. I worked entirely alone by the dim, flickering golden light of a single wax candle, carefully cutting into cold, stiff, grayish limbs with a small, razor-sharp knife to uncover and truly understand the complex architecture of the hidden muscles, the branching, pulsing rivers of the blue veins, and the tight, white ropes of the tough tendons. I desperately needed to know exactly what lay hidden beneath the fragile surface of the skin. For how could I ever hope to create convincing life if I did not intimately and fearlessly understand the gruesome reality of death? My dark obsession made me incredibly arrogant, and my notoriously sharp tongue quickly earned me bitter enemies. Pietro Torrigiano, a much older fellow student, burdened with a notoriously brutal temper, grew increasingly tired of my constant, biting mockery of his inferior drawing skills. One humid afternoon, standing inside the quiet Brancacci Chapel while we were studying the frescoes of Masaccio, he turned abruptly and struck me squarely on the bridge of the nose with his heavy, clenched fist. I clearly heard the fragile bone shatter loudly, snapping like a dry winter twig. The resulting pain was entirely blinding, a sudden, explosive flash of brilliant red light in the otherwise dark and solemn chapel. Blood poured down my face, staining my tunic crimson. I carried that broken, ugly, flattened nose for the entire duration of my 88 years, a permanent, disfiguring reminder of my own foolish pride and the violent, uncontrollable passions of youth. When Lorenzo died tragically in the year 1492, the beautiful city of Florence rapidly descended into the terrifying madness of the apocalyptic friar Girolamo Savonarola. The roaring bonfires of the vanities consumed the city's secular soul. Fearing for my future, I fled southward to Rome, a sprawling, chaotic city of ancient ruins, a vast, decaying graveyard of fallen empires. I was only 24 years old, virtually unknown, painfully poor, and absolutely desperate to prove the immense magnitude of my genius to the world. The wealthy French Cardinal Jean de Bellairs commissioned me to sculpt a grand memorial for his final resting place. The subject was to be a Virgin Mary gently holding the lifeless body of her dead son, the Pietà. I traveled personally to the high, treacherous quarries of Carrara to carefully select the massive block of stone myself. The jagged mountains were completely silent, incredibly majestic, and deeply intimidating. I spent long, exhausting weeks walking tirelessly among the sheer, blindingly white peaks, breathing the cold, crisp, thin mountain air, desperately searching for the one perfect, flawless vein of marble. When I finally found it, it was exactly as if the sleeping stone had loudly called out my name. It was absolutely pure, entirely unblemished, and luminous, glowing like the pale skin of a heavenly angel. I shipped it back to Rome at great expense and immediately locked myself away inside my dusty workshop. I barely ate anything for months. I survived solely on a few hard crusts of stale bread and a little watered-down sour wine. My working hands bled continuously. Thick calluses tore violently open, wept blood, and slowly reformed into thick, leathery armor. I did not merely carve the marble with cold steel. I tenderly caressed it. I furiously fought it. I obsessively polished it until the hard stone resembled warm, pliant wax. I vividly remember the exhausting final days of the rigorous polishing process, tirelessly using rough pumice stone and bundles of dry straw, rubbing the curved surfaces of the stone until it shone brilliantly with a warm inner light. When the completed work was finally unveiled in the dim light of the old St. Peter's Basilica, grown men openly wept. The heavy marble drapery of the Virgin's voluminous robes cascaded downwards exactly like real, soft fabric, pooling heavily around the limp, profoundly lifeless, incredibly heavy body of Christ. The stark, emotional contrast between her eternal, youthful purity and the heavy, cold, brutal reality of his heavy corpse was nothing short of a miracle of stone. Yet, one sunny afternoon, I stood silently and unrecognized among a large crowd of admiring visitors who had traveled from the region of Lombardy. I heard them whispering in hushed, awed tones. One man eagerly asked who had created this divine masterpiece, and another confidently and loudly replied that it was their own countryman, a sculptor named Il Gobbo from Milan. Jealous rage, pure and burning like a furnace, instantly seized my pounding heart. That very same night, under the cover of a moonless sky, I crept back into the silent church carrying a small lantern, a heavy iron hammer, and a sharp, thin chisel. The long shadows danced wildly on the stone walls as I carefully climbed up onto the marble pedestal. Right across the smooth diagonal band crossing the gentle chest of the Virgin Mary, I furiously carved my name. Michelangelo Buonarroti of Florence made this. It was an act of supreme, unforgivable vanity, a grave sin of pride I would deeply regret and absolutely never repeat. I never signed another sculpture as long as I lived. In the year 1501, I returned to the familiar streets of Florence. The proud republic had miraculously survived the political chaos and desperately wanted a massive public symbol of its renewed civic strength. The influential wardens of the great cathedral possessed a massive, towering block of white marble that had been disastrously ruined by a sculptor named Agostino di Duccio exactly 40 years earlier. It lay abandoned in the dusty courtyard of the cathedral works, resembling a dead, bloated white whale, terribly botched, horribly gouged, and completely abandoned to the harsh elements. Other highly respected masters, even the great Leonardo da Vinci himself, loudly proclaimed that the block was completely useless, stating that the delicate internal proportions were hopelessly and permanently destroyed. But when I stared into the rough, damaged face of the stone, I saw him trapped deep inside. I clearly saw David, incredibly tense, intensely watchful, silently waiting for the heavy footsteps of the approaching giant. I immediately demanded that a tall wooden enclosure be built entirely around the massive block, so that absolutely no one could witness my agonizing, intimate struggle with the stone. For almost 3 solid years, I practically lived inside that cramped, dusty wooden shed. The intense, baking heat of the long Florentine summers was completely suffocating, quickly turning the flying white marble dust into a thick, suffocating, gritty paste on my constantly sweaty skin. The freezing, biting winters chilled my aching bones to the very marrow. I worked with a terrifying, relentless fury that genuinely frightened even my own hired assistants. I would violently attack the marble, swinging the heavy hammer so hard that I made the sharp, jagged chips fly dangerously through the air, like thick, blinding snow in a winter blizzard. I painstakingly carved the thick, swollen veins popping out on his large right hand, the incredibly strong hand that firmly held the smooth, deadly stone. I carefully carved the deep, anxious furrow right in the center of his brow, capturing the intense look of terrifying, absolute concentration. The famous terribilità in the fleeting moment right before the violent release of the deadly sling. I desperately wanted to perfectly capture the exact, fleeting moment where keen human intellect and raw physical courage unite perfectly to completely overcome massive brute force. When the wooden enclosure was finally, dramatically dismantled in the year 1504, the stunned silence of the massive crowd gathered in the square was absolute and deafening. Then, a massive, roaring eruption of pure awe echoed through the city. He stood beautifully proud, exactly 17 feet tall, a breathtaking colossus of absolute perfect proportions, warmly bathed in the magnificent golden light of the setting Tuscan sun. The incredibly arduous, dangerous task of moving his massive weight to the central Piazza della Signoria took 40 strong men and 4 exhausting days. Slowly and carefully rolling the heavy, towering giant on heavily greased, cylindrical wooden beams, through the incredibly narrow, winding medieval streets. David instantly became the beating, courageous heart of Florence, and I, at the remarkably young age of 29, became revered as a living god among mortal men. But I soon learned that the much higher you ascend toward the heavens, the much more violent and destructive the howling winds of fate become. My absolute greatest tormentor, and ironically my absolute greatest patron, was the fearsome Pope Julius II. He was universally known as the Warrior Pope, a man whose fiery temper perfectly matched my own. He imperiously summoned me back to the city of Rome in the year 1505 to design and build his massive papal tomb. He envisioned a colossal, breathtaking architectural mountain of pure white marble, decorated with exactly 40 life-sized statues. It was a glorious, intoxicating dream that would slowly and agonizingly turn into a crushing, lifelong nightmare spanning exactly 40 years. A tragedy I would bitterly call the tragedy of the tomb. I immediately spent 8 exhausting months high up in the mountains of Carrara, just supervising the dangerous excavation of the massive blocks, breathing the freezing, clean mountain air, happily dreaming of the beautiful, muscular figures struggling heroically against the confining stone. But upon my triumphant return to Rome, the notoriously fickle Pope's mind had entirely changed. His jealous enemies, particularly including the influential architect Bramante, had maliciously whispered in his ear that it was terrible, fatal luck to build a massive tomb while still breathing the air of the living. They cleverly convinced him to assign me an entirely different task, a nearly impossible task, specifically meant to publicly humiliate me and ruin my stellar reputation. They forcefully demanded that I paint the massive vaulted ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. I was a master sculptor, not a mere fresco painter. I had learned only the absolute basic rudiments of wet fresco as a young boy in the crowded workshop with Ghirlandaio. But to successfully paint a continuously curving, vaulted ceiling of roughly 12,000 square feet was absolute, raving madness. I angrily refused the absurd commission. I immediately fled the city of Rome on a fast, stolen horse, riding relentlessly through the dark night until I safely reached the protective borders of Florentine territory. But the Pope's resulting wrath was truly terrifying to behold. He violently threatened to wage bloody war upon the entire city of Florence if I did not immediately return to his service. The terrified city council desperately begged me to go back, pleading with me to appease the furious pontiff and save their homes from destruction. Extremely reluctantly, feeling exactly like a doomed, condemned man slowly walking up the wooden steps to the hangman's gallows, I angrily returned to Rome in the year 1508. I absolutely refused to use Bramante's poorly designed scaffolding. Instead, I personally designed and built a highly specialized, innovative wooden bridge, resting securely on sturdy wooden brackets directly inserted into the high masonry walls, towering dizzyingly high above the beautiful marble floor of the cavernous chapel. For 4 continuous, entirely agonizing years, I lived and suffered much closer to the painted heaven above than to the solid earth below. The immense, cumulative physical toll on my aging body was entirely beyond adequate description. I had to constantly stand and painfully bend completely backward, my aching neck severely craned upward day after day, week after week, month after endless month. My strained, bloodshot eyes became so completely accustomed to constantly looking upward that when I occasionally received a handwritten letter from my family, I actually had to hold the paper high above my head just to be able to focus on the ink. The stagnant air trapped up near the ceiling was incredibly thick and heavy with the nauseating smell of damp, drying plaster and the sharp, burning, alkaline bite of quicklime. I had to work incredibly fast, desperately applying the bright earth pigments directly onto the wet intonaco plaster before it dried and ruined the chemical bond. The heavily diluted paint dripped continuously, falling directly into my stinging eyes, thickly coating my sweaty face and heavily matting my unwashed hair and long beard. I frequently looked exactly like a monstrous, hideous creature entirely born of wet, brightly colored mud. My aching spine grew a permanent, painful knot. My breastbone was heavily crushed inward like a broken harp, and my digestive bowels became a tight, painful pouch of constant agony. I angrily fired absolutely all my hired assistants within the first few weeks. Their inferior, uninspired work completely lacked the divine, terrifying power, the terribilita that I absolutely demanded. I bravely painted the entire vast, sprawling expanse entirely alone. I painted the dramatic, explosive separation of blinding light from the infinite darkness, the gentle, life-giving creation of the first man, Adam, the tragic, sorrowful fall of man from the garden, and the terrifying, destructive, churning waters of the great flood. I passionately poured all my boiling anger, my crushing loneliness, and my desperate, lifelong search for the face of God directly into those colossal, twisting figures. The massive prophets and the muscular sibyls twist and turn violently in their painted architectural niches, seemingly trapped forever in their impossibly muscular bodies, heavily burdened by the terrible, crushing weight of their divine prophecy. The impatient Pope would very frequently climb the creaking wooden scaffolding, highly impatient, loudly demanding to know exactly when the massive ceiling would finally be completely finished. "When will it be done?" he would angrily bark, loudly striking the wooden planks of my platform with his heavy silver cane. "When it completely satisfies me in its artistic details," I would furiously scream back right into his face, absolutely not caring that he was easily the most powerful, dangerous man in all of Christendom. Once, in a fit of rage, he actually threatened to have me violently thrown down from the high scaffolding to shatter on the marble floor. We constantly fought like two proud, wounded lions, securely locked together inside a small cage. But when the beautiful, vibrant chapel was finally officially opened to the stunned public on the 1st of November, 1512, the entire world stopped breathing in unison. The brilliant, glowing colors, the deep lapis lazuli blues, the incredibly brilliant terra verde greens, and the intensely burning Sinopia yellows vibrated deeply with a pure, raw, celestial energy. The jealous Bramante was completely silenced. The brilliant young Raphael was left entirely in awe. I had completely conquered the difficult art of painting, but the grand victory tasted exactly like dry, bitter ashes inside my mouth, for my exhausted body was completely broken, and I was deeply, profoundly, and permanently alone. Many long, turbulent decades quickly passed. Powerful popes died and new ones quickly ascended the golden throne of St. Peter. The glorious, bright, beautifully optimistic world of my early youth, the golden world of Lorenzo the Magnificent, was completely shattered into a million pieces. The holy city of Rome was brutally and violently sacked by ruthless imperial mercenary troops in the terrible year 1527. Warm red blood ran freely in the cobbled streets, the piercing screams of violated women echoing endlessly through the sacred, looted basilicas. The political and spiritual air grew very dark, entirely clouded with the harsh reality of religious reform and the terrifying looming shadows of the brutal Inquisition. In the year 1536, at the advanced age of 61, Pope Paul III officially ordered me to carefully prepare and paint the massive altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. The monumental subject was to be the Last Judgment. It was absolutely no longer the appropriate time for elegant, calm, soothing beauty. It was the dark time for divine wrath, for immense terror, and for the terrifying, naked truth of the fragile human soul laid completely bare before its omnipotent Creator. I passionately painted a massive, swirling vortex of hundreds of naked, heavily muscular bodies forcefully ascending upward to heaven, or being violently and cruelly dragged downward into the fiery pits of hell. There is absolutely no comforting architectural perspective, no soothing green landscape to rest the eyes upon. There is only raw, twisting flesh and an infinite, terrifying expanse of deep, flat, lapis lazuli blue. I painted Jesus Christ, the ultimate judge, not as a gentle, forgiving shepherd of men, but as a towering, angry, beardless Apollo, his massive, heavily muscled right arm raised high in an unstoppable, terrifying gesture of eternal, absolute damnation. I meticulously painted the hideous, scaly demons violently pulling screaming souls downward by their testicles, mercilessly twisting their soft bodies in excruciating, unending physical agony. The rampant, unyielding hypocrisy of the wealthy papal court was immediately and deeply outraged by the overwhelming amount of explicit male nudity. The pompous, arrogant master of ceremonies, Biagio da Cesena, loudly and publicly complained to the Pope that it was a disgraceful, highly inappropriate work fit only for a common roadside tavern or a filthy public bathhouse. In immediate, furious retaliation, I carefully painted his exact, recognizable face directly onto the muscular body of Minos, the demonic judge of the underworld, happily giving him a large pair of hairy donkey ears and a massive, coiled green serpent painfully biting his exposed genitals. When the furious Biagio angrily complained to the Pope, the pontiff merely laughed aloud and wittily said his papal jurisdiction did not extend into the depths of hell. Yet, deeply hidden amidst the chaotic fury of the massive Last Judgment, I secretly hid my own profound, crushing personal despair. Look very closely at the flayed, empty skin of St. Bartholomew, loosely held by the bearded saint in his large left hand. If you look very closely at the hollow, drooping, melted face on that empty, pathetic sack of skin, you will clearly see my own recognizable portrait. A grotesque, deeply tragic self-portrait of an exhausted man, entirely hollowed out by his own demanding art, literally flayed alive by the impossible demands of greedy popes and the relentless, consuming fire of his own inescapable genius. I truly felt entirely unworthy of divine salvation. In those quiet, fading twilight years, I finally, miraculously found a tiny, precious sliver of warm human comfort in my deep, intimate friendship with Vittoria Colonna, the noble Marchioness of Pescara. She was a remarkable woman of immense, towering intellect and profound, unshakable piety. Her beautifully written, elegant letters, were exactly like cool, refreshing spring water poured onto my terribly parched, cracking soul. We would frequently sit together for hours in the quiet, shaded, peaceful gardens of the convent of San Silvestro, the sweet, intoxicating scent of blooming orange blossoms graciously masking the foul smell of the dusty, crowded Roman streets just outside the high walls. We spoke quietly and passionately of divine grace, of the deep mysteries of faith, and of the agonizing, impossible distance between the flawed, mortal human hand and the pure divine perfection it constantly seeks to capture. When she suddenly died, a terrible, freezing cold darkness immediately settled permanently over my aching heart. I went to silently see her lifeless body, and my absolute greatest regret, a regret that haunts my dreams, was that I only respectfully kissed her cold hand and not her pale forehead or her soft cheek. To suddenly lose her bright presence was to completely lose the very last heavy anchor keeping my drifting ship moored to this painful mortal world. In my final lonely decades, they surprisingly made me the chief architect of the massive, sprawling St. Peter's Basilica. I stubbornly and absolutely refused to accept even a single coin of salary for the immense labor. I worked tirelessly only for the profound love of God and the desperate, fading hope for the salvation of my immortal soul. I brilliantly designed the great soaring dome, proudly lifting it high toward the heavens, a massive ribbed crown of heavy travertine stone meant to completely unify the chaotic, sprawling, disorganized church spreading out beneath it. I walked the noisy, dusty construction site daily. An old, highly irritable, famously grumpy man wearing deeply worn, cracked leather boots and a dusty, stained black wool cloak. I was almost completely deaf in one ear. My once piercing eyesight was rapidly failing me, and my tired, calloused hands constantly trembled with the deep, creeping chill of extreme old age. But my architectural mind was far sharper and more focused than it had ever been. I fiercely fought deeply corrupt building contractors. I mercilessly fired thieving laborers, and I jealously guarded the absolute mathematical purity of the grand design with the terrifying, unyielding ferocity of a starving, chained dog. And yet, despite the grand, sweeping majesty of the massive architecture, I always, inevitably, returned to my first true love, the heavy iron chisel. In the dead, silent pitch of the long Roman nights, alone inside my large, dilapidated, drafty house in the neighborhood of Machel de Corvi, I obsessively worked on my final, tragic marble sculptures, the late Pietas. These were absolutely no longer the highly polished, impossibly beautiful, youthful virgins of my confident early youth. These were incredibly rough, heavily textured, agonizing blocks of pure, unadulterated sorrow. I worked endlessly on the Florentine Pietà, originally intending it to be placed directly over my own personal tomb. I carefully carved my own tired features into the hooded face of Nicodemus, an old, weary, sorrowful man tenderly and heavily supporting the massive, broken, lifeless body of Jesus Christ. But the large block of marble was deeply and fatally flawed. Hot sparks frequently flew from the sharp edge of the striking chisel. The stubborn stone was incredibly hard and completely filled with impossible, ruinous veins of emery. One terrible, dark night, in a sudden blinding fit of complete frustration and absolute crushing despair at my total inability to physically achieve the divine perfection I saw so clearly in my mind, I suddenly grabbed a massive, heavy iron hammer and violently, repeatedly smashed the left arm and the left leg of the Christ figure. I truly tried to completely destroy the entire work. I was 80 years old, miserably trapped inside a rapidly failing, agonizingly painful body, violently enraged that the stubborn stone would no longer effortlessly obey my mental commands as it once had. My loyal, terrified servant Antonio actually had to physically restrain me, crying openly and desperately begging me to drop the heavy hammer and stop the destruction. I eventually, sadly, gave the broken, tragic pieces away to a friend. My absolute final, painful days on earth were spent laboring slowly on the Rondinini Pietà. It is a strange, haunting work of pure, unfiltered spiritual energy. The rough bodies of the Virgin and Christ are incredibly elongated, completely stripped of any muscular detail, appearing almost entirely weightless, literally melting and fusing directly into one another. The glorious, heroic physical perfection of the young David, or the explosive, muscular power of the Sistine Chapel, was completely and utterly gone. What powerfully remained was only the raw, desperate, naked human plea for divine salvation. The heavy chisel marks left on the stone are deep, violent, frantic gashes. It is the urgent, desperate carving of a dying man, furiously trying to dig his own way out of the heavy material world and cross directly into the ethereal spiritual one. I worked on it slowly, painfully standing up, just a few short days before my final breath, wearing a strange, homemade cardboard helmet with a thick wax candle securely stuck directly into the top of it, just to properly illuminate the pale stone in the dark, freezing room. I was 88 years old. I could strongly smell the damp, rich earth eagerly calling out to me from the open grave. I vividly felt the creeping, icy cold slowly moving up my swollen, aching legs. I had single-handedly created an entire, vast universe composed of carved marble and wet paint, heavily populated by beautiful gods, fierce prophets, and towering giants. But in the final, quiet end, I was just a deeply tired, incredibly frightened old man, absolutely terrified of standing before the awful judgment seat, weakly holding a dulled iron chisel with a violently trembling, heavily calloused hand. I willingly and completely traded my entire mortal life, my earthly happiness, and my very flesh to capture a brief, fleeting glimpse of eternal, untouchable beauty. And now, the swirling marble dust finally settles. The heavy iron hammer falls completely silent, and absolutely all that remains in the empty dark is the echoing, eternal testament of the speaking stone. I look back upon the 88 years of my existence, and I see nothing but a continuous, grueling war waged against the unyielding rock. They called me a divine creator, but there is absolutely nothing divine about the relentless agony in my twisted spine, the blinding pain behind my failing eyes, or the ruined joints that betray my intentions in this final, solitary hour. I was merely a fragile vessel, a hollowed-out mortal shell through which a higher, terrible power chose to manifest its unbearable glory. I poured every ounce of my living spirit, every bitter drop of my sweat, and all the tender warmth of my vanished youth into the cold, silent blocks of mountain marble. I gave those pale stones breath. I gave them rippling sinew. I gave them weeping souls. And in a brutal exchange, They slowly drained my very life force. Now, as the evening shadows lengthen ominously across the dusty floor of my humble studio, the silence feels infinitely heavier than the massive stone blocks themselves. I have loved with a fierce, burning passion throughout my days, yet my truest loves were never soft flesh and mortal blood. They were the mighty prophets struggling to emerge from the quarry, the weeping mother tenderly cradling her broken son, the giant shepherd boy standing brave and defiant against the golden dawn. They belong entirely to the world now, standing eternally frozen in their perfect agony and triumphant grace, while I slowly crumble into the wretched dust from which I was originally made. Men and women will look upon my arduous labors long after my own name becomes a mere forgotten whisper on the cold wind. Hundreds of years from now, perhaps in the year 2026, absolute strangers from distant, unimaginable lands will stand in awe beneath the painted vaults and before the towering altars I left behind. They will stare upward, their mouths hanging open in silent wonder, and they will feel a brief echo of the same divine terror that drove my relentless heart to the very brink of madness. They will not see the bleeding, battered hands that painstakingly carved those colossal figures, nor will they hear the desperate, lonely prayers I muttered in the freezing darkness of endless winter nights. They will only witness the pure beauty, the terrible, unforgiving beauty that fiercely demanded my absolute, unconditional surrender. And I finally understand that this is exactly as it must be. The mortal artist must disappear entirely into the shadows so that the immortal art may endure brightly forever. I approach the terrifying end of my earthly journey not with trembling fear, but with a profound, overwhelming, and exhausting relief. The heavy hammer is simply too much to lift now. The iron chisel is far too dull to bite the stone. The great eternal judge who waits for me beyond the mysterious veil will not ask to see my earthly wealth, my accumulated gold, or my worldly titles. He will only ask to see the deep scars upon my fragile soul, and I will gladly show him these ruined hands that bled willingly to bring his heavenly visions down to this sorrowful, desperate earth. I leave behind no royal dynasty of children, no vast earthly empire of conquered lands. Only the silent, towering companions born from the deep mountainsides. They are my ultimate enduring confession. They are my final, desperate plea for everlasting mercy. May the speaking stone testify for my fractured spirit when my human voice is extinguished forever. I now surrender my tired soul to the infinite, welcoming light, trusting faithfully that the enduring beauty I forcefully dragged from the dark earth will eternally atone for the countless hidden sins of my mortal heart. Thank you for traveling through history with us. Subscribe now to Lumen of Ages for more tales, and don't forget to comment below.